The way the anti-Christian argument gets made in late modernity is that it's God's fault, but this time it's God's fault for putting us on this whole dangerous project in the first place. And the atheist scientific explanation is we got science to prove that witchcraft is impossible. I don't think that's even been proven in 2025. These women had made a pact with the devil, but then the way it got reconstructed, because it was right afterwards that the witchcraft trials ended, and people sort of realized pretty fast they'd kind of collectively lost their mind.
Peter Thiel is known for being something like the Antichrist and bringing up wild claims about AI source for the Antichrist, which is wild. So when he has this conversation with Jordan Peterson, he brings up a lot about Christianity and the rise of technology. So I want to dive into this. I think it's super fascinating. Let's go.
But a lot of it had sort of an anti-biblical valence, and you could say that 17th and 18th century scientists, and again, this is where I think someone like Francis Bacon needs to be interpreted as a hardcore materialist atheist, and it is we need to stop religion because it's slowing down this wonderful scientific progress. Mm-hmm. And then I've had this Bacon discussion with a number of people lately, and they all think, no, that can't be right. Bacon was just this somewhat heterodox Christian. And because in late modernity, where we find ourselves, again, it's complicated to describe what's going on culturally, but in late modernity, it's the atheist liberals that are anti-science at this point. And so if you think about Hollywood,
Richard Dawkins' despair.
Yeah, you have to think of Richard Dawkins as a representative of early modernity. He is like a fossil from before 1789.
He's the last of the Enlightenment.
He's the last.
Imagine saying that though, and how disrespected those people would feel if they were told that they were against science. They'd be like, "How dare you say that? I am for science, and you know it."
He's a fossil from before 1789, and Greta is more representative. Or if you think about the Hollywood atheist liberals, the movies are all about technology that doesn't work. It's scary, and so to the extent the way the anti-Christian argument gets made in late modernity is that it's God's fault, but this time it's God's fault for putting us on this whole dangerous project in the first place. And it's like the lines in Genesis: "You shall have dominion over the earth." So in the 17th and 18th century, the Christian God was blamed for slowing down the scientific technological project. In the 20th and 21st century, the Christian God gets blamed for speeding it up, speeding up, keeping it going. So it's that the invariant is the Christian God always gets blamed, but the fact that it's the exact opposite tells us something very interesting about how this is transformed.
Now that's interesting, because you're making the point that two opposite arguments are making that are both directed towards furthering Nietzsche's death of God, let's say. So then that begs the question: what's the actual motivation?
The only point I'll make is that we're again in a very different place with science and technology than we were in the 17th, 18th century. 17th, 18th century, I don't think people would have said, we're going to make all this progress, and then there's going to be a lot of pushback, and it'll get regulated. I know the thought was we'll make a lot of progress, and it'll be so good that it will actually then accelerate, and it'll smash religion even more, and then we can go even faster, and it'll go even better, and it's going to have this sort of unraveling, accelerating effect. And then in the 20th, 21st century, we make the opposite argument as there are some things in this project that have gone somewhat haywire.
Wow.
Okay, so let's pick.
To completely throw out the idea that there's this theistic deity out there and that everything can be explained by a natural phenomenon, a natural explanation, is being just as much closed-minded as someone who only thinks that there's a God who created the universe and everything has to be explained from a theistic worldview. But you're just as closed-minded if you say none of it can be explained. Everything is only explained from a naturalistic worldview.
On the religious thread for a moment, I mean, I've been trying to understand the relationship between Christian Europe, let's say, and the dawn of the scientific age for a long time. And so let me outline something for you, and then I'll turn back to exactly what you said. So it seems to me, I mean, much of the early science was done in the monasteries that turned into universities. And so there's certainly a trail from Christianity through the monasteries to the universities. And so you can think about that as concrete evidence of the underpinning of much of the scientific revolution in terms of at least the offshoots of Christianity. But I think there's something deeper there. And so I've tried to make this case with Dawkins, for example, not least after he called himself a cultural Christian. So it seems to me that for science to get going as a motivational project, there are some assumptions you have to make that aren't scientific. So there are axioms before the game gets going. And I think they're faith-based axioms. One is that the cosmos is intelligible, that it's intelligible to the human mind, and that diligent investigation of that intelligibility produces an increment in knowledge, both conceptual and practical, and that increment in knowledge is good. But then there's maybe a deeper presumption, which is that increment in knowledge can be good if the point of the knowledge pursuit remains encapsulated in something like the underlying Christian ethos. And then I would say that fractures in a way, perhaps Bacon's a turning point, where the reliance of the scientific endeavor on these metaphysical presuppositions is questioned. Or like when I presented Dawkins with that argument, he just waved his hands over and he said he doesn't have any metaphysical assumptions underlying his brand of science. And I think that is what the more radical Enlightenment French Revolution types thought, is that no, we've escaped from the underlying religious ethos. Okay, the problem with that is, it seems to me, and I think this might have to do with this apocalyptic kickback, is that once you unmoor yourself from the underlying ethos, which is even the ethos that defines what constitutes knowledge and progress itself, then the Luciferian element of the scientific endeavor can begin to loom extremely large.
Well, again, let's start with the early modern history, and I'm always a sort of hardcore Girardian, this great thinker, intellectual, sort of, in some ways, Christian polymath that I studied under Stanford in the late 80s, 90s, and influenced me tremendously. And, you know, these things are, again, very complicated intellectual history questions, but certainly one intuition that's odd about your telling would be that you would say that, you know, we had sort of a law-centered monotheistic tradition also in Islam, also in Judaism. And if we say there was something about Christianity that where this really came, and it was not in the Islamic world that you got the scientific revolution, for example, it suggests that maybe it wasn't just the metaphysics, not just the theological metaphysics that drove it, but something like the Christian anthropology. Girard was fond of always saying that people focus too much in the Bible on what it tells us about God, but there must also be something it tells us about man. About man.
Yeah. Okay.
And certainly the Girardian intuition is that one of the things is always that there's this really big problem of violence and scapegoating, and that in some ways, some sense Judaism and then Christianity, it's the same story. It's the same story of sacrifice, but it's told not from the point of view of the violent community. It's told from the point of view of the innocent victim. And there's a certain way where it sets in process this gradual, this dynamic revelation that leads to this sort of gradual unraveling. And as you stop believing in scapegoats, you're forced to come up with other explanations, and that includes science. So, for example, you can ask, why did the witchcraft trials come to an end? And the atheist scientific explanation is, we got science to prove that witchcraft is impossible. And I don't think that's even been proven in 2025, because we don't know everything. Maybe it's a lost art that's been lost. Maybe you can go to a bookstore in Berkeley, buy a book on how to be a witch.
I think a lot of people are realizing that there's a lot of witchcraft happening today. And I like his point that he's about to bring up, and says, and the reason why they maybe were killing these witches is because they were worried that they made a pact with the devil. But in reality, anytime you take a human life, you are working with the devil as well, essentially. But I would say is the reason why scientific methods and the growth of enlightenment is because of Christianity.
Placebo effect and magic.
And so that, but then the Girardian alternate story of why the witchcraft trials ended were that at some point people realized that this sort of collective scapegoating in some ways was like a version of the death of Christ. The witches were not absolutely innocent like Christ, but they were relatively innocent. It was a community that went crazy. And then and then once you know that the witches are innocent or are relatively innocent, then you steel yourself and force yourself to find natural explanations. If you don't think that it was, I don't know, the Jews that poisoned the wells in the Middle Ages, eventually,
or some devils, or
eventually, this was during the Salem witch trials. There were these, you had these competing sermons on Sundays, and the initial ones were sort of these women had made a pact with the devil, but then the way it got reconstructed, because it was right afterwards that the witchcraft trials ended, and people sort of realized pretty fast they'd kind of collectively lost their minds. And the alternate one was, the devil had entered the whole community and had possessed all of Salem. And those were the sermons you gave in the aftermath of the witchcraft trials. And then in that sort of a context, maybe science was also a way to find, you can steel yourself to find natural explanations. When you're in an archaic, thing, scapegoating is always an explanation. It's this person did this, that person did this, it's that person's fault. And when you say those explanations won't do, maybe you're forced to do
right. So
scientific explanations. So there are all these different threads one can stress. But
I wonder if that was
I
also.
I think you have to always ask this question: what was specific about the Christian message that really enabled this? I think there was a way the Jewish context was extremely learned, and people, I don't know, if you compare the Talmudic abilities already in the Middle Ages to understand the Bible, to read it, it was as good or better than anything that the Christian scholastics were doing. But somehow it never really got a part of society to orient in this other way.
So,
but again, it's obviously a complicated history.
Well, so one of the things you pointed out there that's very interesting is that Christianity, the rise of Christianity destroyed the pagan world, and that's a great mystery. But one of the epistemological consequences of that was the notion that deities weren't widespread. That idea had to disappear. The Romans had gods for their archways, right? So there was an idea that there were invisible spirits, so to speak, that were operating behind the scenes that could easily be interpreted as causal mechanisms. But you can imagine then, I'm also trying to integrate this with what I learned from Jung. You can imagine that as the world's desacralized at the pagan level, and the kinds of interpretations that you just described are no longer tenable, right? There are these invisible agencies, some of them personalities that are operating, that isn't working anymore. that gets all aggregated into a monotheistic deity and the magic gets pulled out of the world. See, Jung also pointed out that as the Christian revolution transpired, the alchemical mythology started to become widespread, and that there was a idea that developed that there were mysteries lurking in the material world that had redemptive capacity. And so you could imagine that.
Which is true, because when you believe in the Christian God, the God who created the heavens and the earth, who's the creator of all things, you realize that there's not a God of thunder anymore. There's not a God of rain anymore. There's nothing that you pray to outside of the God of the Bible that causes these things interacting within your life. And I think when Christianity comes around, they realize, well, actually, we're going to learn about how these clouds and molecules come together or whatever to form rain. Like there's nothing crazy going on there.
The spirits are taken out of the world. The suspicion, you already said this, the suspicion that there are other causal forces at work starts to make itself manifest in at least the imaginations of people who are on the cutting edge. And so I wonder if is that a inevitable consequence of the victory of Christianity over the pagan world? Because it gets desacralized merely because everything that's divine gets united into a single figure.
I think it was somewhere in Karl Marx where he says that, all social criticism starts with a criticism of religion. And then the Christian addendum, I would always say, was that Jesus Christ was the first person to actually do that, really, and started that whole process where, you can think so much of it was, calling into question the social institutions, the religious institutions, in a way deconstructing them, and there's something about this that is, I think is true. I think there is something about it that has an unraveling character, and I don't think you can go back. We can't go back to these pagan institutions once they have been deconstructed, and maybe the gods get recharacterized as demons or psychosocial phenomena,
or unconscious manifestations.
But that doesn't sound like the way you really bring Zeus back, into the way it would have been understood by the average person in ancient Greece or something like that. But yeah, I think there's one of the other dimensions that Girard, it was sort of this combination of literature and anthropology, but also there was always a psychological dimension to Girard, and the psychological intuition in Girard is that there's something about human beings being imitative that's very deep, very important, very underexplored, and it is that you have something like it's something like I believe it's in Aristotle. Man differs from the other animals in its greater aptitude for imitation.
Yeah, it's a huge difference between us and other animals.
And then you could say this is like, and of course Darwinism says our closest relatives are the apes, and the apes they imitate. And so we differ from the apes in being more ape-like than the apes. If you sort of combine the Aristotelian and the Darwinian one, that's kind of a very, very strange thing in a way. And then the problem, the good thing about imitation is this is how culture gets transmitted. This is how you learn language. Without imitation, nothing like the sort of cultural edifice that we have would work.
Well, I think that Christianity as a whole is something that's going to further the scientific exploration. It's going to cause more designs, more things, more understandings to come about when you allow yourself to have a theistic worldview. So I would love to know what you guys think in the description, in the comments below, whatever that may be. I would love to do that. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I encourage you to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't. Now, remember, guys, Jesus loves you.